There, my name is Jasmine Mogavero, and I'm a clinical neuropsychologist and assistant professor at the University of Utah School of Medicine. I'm so happy to be able to present some information on language today, particularly on the abilities of naming and comprehension. Language is so important because it is the primary system of communication for which we utilize words or symbols through speech, writing, or gestures to convey meaning. Language serves as the foundation for exchanging messages and ideas. Ultimately, the communication that occurs through language underlies most of what we consider to be uniquely human. So in this presentation, we will briefly go over the neuroanatomical regions important for language and communication. Then we will investigate the language abilities of naming and comprehension, as well as what impairments can happen when there are deficits in naming or comprehension, and how us neuropsychologists go about assessment of these abilities. Finally, we will briefly review some well-known language disorders. So let's start with brain lateralization. This is when one side of the brain shows greater involvement in an ability or function than the other side. And it's sometimes associated with the dominant hand that we use for writing or other activities. Language is considered to be one of the most lateralized human brain functions. In fact, the left side of our brain is dominant for language in over 95% of those who are right-handers and in over 60 to 70% of left-handers. The image in front of you is known as the Wernicke-Geschwind model, and it is a historical model that proves to be a good starting point for understanding the basic neuroanatomy of language. It was developed in order to understand the pathways and areas in the brain that are responsible for the comprehension and production of speech. Certain areas of the brain communicate with others in order to gain information about the meanings of words before that information is passed on to other areas of the brain. So this picture shows how first an auditory or sound stimuli like words said aloud arrives from the ears and is then processed in the primary auditory cortex, so right over here. Then the information is sent to the part of the brain known as Wernicke's area. So right over here, Wernicke's area, which was named after a famous physician who first identified the speech processing center. This brain area helps us comprehend and understand what is being said. Next, the information is then transmitted through a bundle of nerve fibers known as the arcuate fasciculus, right over here, which sends information from Wernicke's area to Broca's area. So Broca's area was another area named by a different famous physician. This area right here is a specialized speech production center, which helps us create a plan for the words we want to use in response to the initial words that we heard. So our word plan is then sent to the primary motor areas over here within the motor cortex. The motor cortex controls all the anatomy that is important for speaking. So things like the tongue, the lips, the palate, larynx, and pharynx. And then we're able to produce speech through our mouth. So now that you know the neuroanatomy of language, let's get into some of the abilities of language. So naming is the first that we'll go over. Naming refers to our ability to say a specific word when needed in conversation, and this happens to be one of the most important parts of human language. In fact, you may recognize a natural and normal difficulty in this ability in your everyday life. You know, when you're about to say a word and you're like, wait, it's at the tip of my tongue. I just can't think of it right now. Well, a deficit in naming like that actually happens when that phenomenon occurs very frequently throughout the day, maybe even more frequently than normal. Anomia is a word that refers to these impairments in word finding difficulties. It involves an inability to name or retrieve common or proper nouns. Anomia is the most common language impairment. Patients with anomia may have frequent pauses or hesitations in their conversational speech. They may talk around the words they want to say, or they may even substitute the word that they want to say with a related word by accident. Finding can take place during conversational speech. In a clinical setting, the ability to retrieve words can be assessed by tests of confrontation naming, which are measures that involve either showing an object or showing a line drawing of an object, like a spoon, to a patient and requesting the correct word. Confrontation naming tasks can help us detect anomia in individuals with neurologic conditions that typically affect the left hemisphere of the brain. The most commonly used test of confrontation naming is known as the Boston naming test. So this slide shows an example of what confrontation naming may look like. When testing my patients, I may point to a particular picture and ask the patient to tell me the word. When assessing for deficits in naming, I will pay very close attention to if a patient gives me the incorrect word, no word at all, or if they hesitate too long before giving me the correct word. So one example of an error that I would see in naming is over here. Let's point that out. So over here, instead of saying escalator, I've had some patients say elevator. So clearly the incorrect word. And actually in that case, they had substituted the word accidentally with a related word. And neuropsychologists call that a semantic paraphasia. So then what is comprehension? Comprehension is also known as receptive language, and it involves the ability to understand and comprehend spoken or written language. That is, language you hear or read. Comprehension impairments occur when people have difficulty understanding this written or spoken information. For example, there may be a difficulty in understanding a sequence of words, which therefore can make it difficult for someone to follow a set of instructions. Typically, we can qualitatively assess another person's comprehension ability through initial impressions of how they communicate in normal conversation. We can do this by judging whether their responses to your questions are logical and appropriate. More formal assessment of auditory comprehension includes the testing of a person's ability to understand and follow commands, as well as respond to yes or no questions correctly. When assessing with commands, an examiner may give commands that vary by complexity. We typically start with simple and familiar commands like close your eyes or open your mouth. And then we progress to unique commands that involve multiple steps, like tap your head with your tongue out. We also use tests that assess a person's understanding of auditory information by asking simple questions like, can a shark fly? And then proceeding with more complex questions that include more challenging syntax and grammar structure, like, are cats chased by mice? The challenging nature of these questions helps reveal difficulties in comprehension. Aphasia is a neurological disorder caused by damage to some of the brain areas responsible for language, and it can impair abilities like naming or comprehension, as well as fluency, writing, and reading. This disorder may result from many different conditions and can develop suddenly, like what we see after a stroke, or slowly, like what we may see during a dementia process. The language impairments observed in aphasia can be strikingly different in each and every patient. A Broca's aphasia is a specific type of aphasia that typically refers to damage in the area of the brain we learned before, Broca's area. In this disorder, abilities like naming, fluency, and repetition of speech are impaired, but comprehension of language is preserved. In Wernicke's aphasia, both comprehension and naming are impaired. This is because Wernicke's area, as we had discussed before in the neuroanatomy slide, is utilized earlier in the process of coordinating language. Therefore, damage to this area causes a more prominent disruption of both naming and comprehension. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation on the language abilities of naming and comprehension.